having me. My name is Lindsey Gallant. I am a art director, concept artist, and co-founder of Sonderlust Studios. We are a new-ish indie game studio, and we're currently working on our first game as a team, which is a unconventional systems-driven narrative game, which is shaping up to be very cool and beautiful and unique. And I would love to tell you all about it someday, but today is not that day because this talk is not about our game, which we are still being very coy and secretive about. This talk is about our company and the weirdly wonderful way that we work. So our company, Sonderlust Studios, started in late 2017, and since day one, we have been a completely remote game studio. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to tell you what a remote studio is, how we make it work for us, and how potentially you can make it work for you. I am here to tell you that yes, the internet is good sometimes, and if you are a person who has ever been on the bad Twitter website, this claim may come as some shock to you, but I will give you some truths and you can decide for yourself. As a quick side note, I'm generally not going to be talking about telecommuting or working from home as it applies outside of games or our studio specifically. If you're interested in that, there are already a billion think pieces on Forbes and LinkedIn and the kind of important business websites that important business people read. So if you're more into that, I suggest you check those out. So first, to kind of give a background and context of where I was before co-founding Sonderlust and my experiences, just to kind of show the origin of all of this. I used to work very, very normally. I worked in an actual physical studio that had actual physical people and actual physical desks, and I would go to my actual physical computer and I'd flail my arms at it until video games came out, as we all do. And it was this sort of big open concept room with a million desks in it where people would unironically fire Nerf guns at each other in the penultimate act of corporate-approved fun. You know, that kind of thing. So after 5 years of squeezing onto crowded rush hour trains, I decided to quit my studio job and become a freelance art director who was working almost entirely from home. I was working mostly with local indie studios in Toronto, where I'm from. I had a few international clients and was also doing a little bit of work on the side in the film and comic industries. So a majority of my clients were local to me in Toronto, just out of virtue of that was what my network was. But even though we were in the same city, very little of my working day would actually be with them physically because I was contracting. So maybe at the beginning of the project, we would meet as an excuse to expense a lunch to our businesses, and we'd maybe do a few like in-person work sessions, but overall, I came to realize pretty quickly that the sort of work I did with people in Toronto actually looked really similar to the people that I worked with internationally, which ultimately meant I spent a lot of time alone in my apartment doing work on my computer and mostly talking with people on Slack and through email. My working process was basically the exact same, whether someone was down the street from me or whether they were halfway across the continent in Arizona. And then something good happened on the bad Twitter website. Another shocker, I was put in contact with Nels Anderson and Brett Duville, who were looking for an art director for their cool new indie game studio. And we all got together and founded Sonderlust, and the rest is history. So the three of us initially were all in different cities, and we still are. And from day one, we have been a completely remote virtual studio, the future. So what does that mean? What is a virtual remote studio? Well, in all the ways that matter, we make video games the exact same way that everybody who doesn't have a remote studio makes video games, which is to say we have core business hours, we have a stand-up scrum in the morning, we do the same kind of project management, we tell very stupid jokes to each other, all pivotal parts of the process, such to say we make video games in the way one would typically make video games. The big difference is that all of our business is conducted completely online because the 7 people on our team and our external studios that we hire for things like audio are located all across North America. So this is the layout of our current team. As you can see, nobody likes to live in the middle. Maybe someday we'll fix it. And so this is what our studio space looks like. This is our virtual office. So we emulate a physical studio, both in feel and communication, by using video chat software all day long. So what that looks like practically is that you start work and you turn on your webcam and you sip your coffee and you talk to your coworkers, and then you have your morning meeting and get started on making video games. So whenever anyone needs to talk about anything, I just flip down my microphone and I talk using my actual human voice, which is a lot faster and easier, it turns out, than typing everything. So if anyone is initially like, oh, that sounds cool, and they're interested, just so you don't have to ask later, the video software we use is called Zoom. But there are a billion different video chat softwares out there. This one just works for our team size and budget and all that good stuff. So, yeah, virtual office. That's your webcam's on all day, huh? That's kind of what people ask. And I get it. It's a little bit creepy at first. It's a little bit 1984, a little bit Big Brother. And that was kind of my initial reaction, too. I was like, I'm not going to do that. Because it feels like you're being watched all day, like the world's most boring version of Terrace House. But once you get used to the webcam, it's actually pretty normal. It feels normal in the way that being in a normal office feels normal. Just because you can stare at your coworkers all day doesn't necessarily mean you do. You probably don't. I'm not going to judge you if that's how you live your life, though. In reality, when we work, we mostly have the video thumbnailed. So this is kind of a screen cap of my working setup in Photoshop. And as you can see, way up in the top right corner there is a very, very thumbnailed video of the feed of the person who had just spoken last. So most of the time, it is very, very low on my radar of attention. And many times I even have it further minimized like this, just telling me that I am in the conference call, but I'm not actually like looking at anyone because I'm doing my work most of the time. So overall, we actually find that this feels a lot like a physical office. It has a lot of the same benefits. We've been working this way over a year and a half now, and there are a ton of really obvious benefits when you compare it to other working models. So first off, the most obvious one is that voice communication is a lot easier than writing everything because we're humans and that's mostly how we talk. There's a lot less miscommunication because you can get people's tone, you can see their body language, you can hear the candor of their voice. It's a lot easier to know what people are talking about when you can actually see them communicating it, as opposed to an email that's largely culled of a lot of context. Generally speaking, it also makes hiring a lot easier because you're not just limited to candidates in your city or people who are willing to move to your city. Instead, you have access to candidates in whatever your entire time zone range is. So for Sonderlust, this is the range of time zone that we designated. It means that even at the most extreme ends of the time zone range, we still have about a half a day of core hours overlap. So it means that we have access to a lot of really talented people that live within this time range zone, but we don't expect anyone to work crazy hours because mental health is great. So we don't have anyone who's working night shifts or needing to have weird hours to try to conform to someone in a certain time zone. So a lot of people already live in this place, which means that when we were reaching out for candidates, there were a tremendous amount of people that were qualified to live in this zone. We have a really incredible team, despite being pretty small and pretty new. And I really just think this wouldn't have happened if we had required everyone to be in the same physical space. Another really great thing about working this way is that you can hire people without making them uproot their entire life for a job. People have families and friends and pets and homes and favorite coffee shops. With remote work, they don't need to tear themselves away from all of that. People in this industry are so used to being nomadic and changing homes, often almost as a requirement of this industry's hiring cycles. And how much happier could we be collectively if we were to examine that and maybe usurp it and see that we can have healthy ways of working by using the internet, which we all use on a daily basis, instead of making unrest and instability a required part of having a career in game development. Relatedly, there's accessibility inherent to having a remote studio. You are going to have access to people who will be benefited by working from home, whether that's people who are differently abled or have chronic illnesses. There is a larger pool, therefore, of diverse talent that you can hire from that you might otherwise be shut out from if you had more physical requirements. This basically means that people are empowered to define their version of what a healthy work setup looks like. There isn't an enforced physical constant that they have to conform to. So practically that means if people's partners work at home, they get to work with their partners all day, which can be great. They can work with their pets around and not have to hire someone to walk their dog every day. I have a little pet rabbit that hangs out with me while I work, and it's like a nice little benefit. Some people who like a more traditional working model can also elect to work in shared spaces with other people. And another great thing is that you can actually work from anywhere. The only requirement is that you have an internet connection. So I found that I've been able to go to a lot more things like Full Indie Summit than I was not able to do as much when I worked in a physical studio. So I can spend a week in Vancouver making video games by your beautiful oceans and mountains, and it doesn't actually impact my productivity or ability to do my job. Furthermore, nobody likes commuting, which is great because when you work in a remote office, you are not required to commute, which also means that you can save money on transit passes or gas, and you can save mental currency on not being rammed butts to nuts with a billion strangers on a packed streetcar at 8:30 every morning for the rest of your life. It is overall a lot less expensive, both for the studio. You don't have to have overhead from renting a physical space, which is great because it means that you can just spend that money on making your damn video game, which is already very expensive. And it's less expensive for individuals because it's not necessary for people to live in the kind of places where video game studios are based, which are often some of the most expensive cities in the world. Never mind the fact that I personally still choose to live in Toronto, which is literally the most expensive city in the world, in Canada currently. But as I get used to this sort of non-traditional way of working, I am examining that more and asking myself, like, why am I doing that? And kind of entertaining fantasies like becoming a roaming sea witch who makes indie games by satellite net connection during the day and wails at passing ships by night. And isn't that the dream, really? I hear you, fellow sea witch. Lastly, it becomes a lot easier to enforce healthy workplace culture and work-life balance when you have the added accountability of a webcam. When I was working from home as a freelancer, I was a bit of a workaholic, which I say with no pride. It was terrible and kind of destroys my life. But when you have the webcam signaling, there's like a physical boundary for your webcam goes on, you begin your workday, your webcam goes off, you end your workday. It's kind of a nice signal to help reinforce to your brain when work time starts and ends. And also there's sort of accountability with people on the studio themselves. So if I'm still working at 8 o'clock, that's actually still within normal work bounds for someone on the West Coast. So they can go, hey, Lindsey, go eat dinner, stop working. And it's a very nice system because sometimes my brain won't tell me that, but people who care about me will. In my experience, going from in studio to working from home as a freelance contractor to working in this virtual studio has made me realize something, and I think that it's something that anyone who's ever worked from home in any capacity could relate to, that I found when I switched from a physical in-studio work setup. I found that I actually really missed people, and I didn't leave my apartment, and almost immediately I became a very strange goblin trash person who no longer knew how to talk to other human beings. It became very easy to just stay in my apartment all day and do work, and I knew it had gotten really bad when one day I went to sat down in my chair to start working, and my knees made a sound like somebody biting into like the spine of a hard shell taco, like not normally at the end, but like right in the middle, and I thought, uh-oh, that's not a sound that the human body should make. And it wasn't, especially not when you're still in your 20s. So that was kind of a signal to me that like something's not right here. I would leave my house for like the first time in an entire week to go buy a coffee or something, and my voice would come out, and it would make this creaking sound like somebody opening up a wooden chest in their grandfather's attic, and it would be very dusty, and I'd have this cognitive dissonance moment of like, oh no, is that what my voice sounds like? Has anyone ever experienced that? You're like, that can't be it. So it was very, very bad, and as much as this admission would have shocked my former teenage self, who sort of wore an affectation of misanthropy and a misguided attempt to rationalize her own debilitating social anxiety, I found very much to my surprise that when I was removed from a physical office space, I really missed people, and people are actually pretty great. And a great thing about this virtual office setup is that it's actually pretty close. Like, it feels pretty close to being in a physical studio. I feel a lot less lonely. My interactions are a lot less weird now, which is great, because I found before every interaction I had was weird, and I knew that that meant that I was the common denominator. So I was the weird, much as I always feared and suspected. But this setup of actually getting to see people, even though it's all online, even though it's only on the internet, it feels pretty close. It feels a lot closer than just seeing people's disembodied text on Slack all day, and mentally it makes stuff a lot nicer. That said, even though we like working this way, I'm not going to tell you that it is perfect. There are downsides and things we're still figuring out, and it should be a process. So some of the non-optimal things I'm going to cover quickly, because I'm coming up on time. First off, a quick thing to keep in mind is that whenever you're doing kind of like a weird way of working, you don't have the benefit of the jillion of think pieces that have already been written about more traditional work setups. So largely, you're sort of pioneering things as you go. You're sort of figuring it out and making it up as you go along. And with that in mind, I think it's really important for all of us, really, to treat our process the same way we treat the process of making a video game. It is a thing that is always changing. It's a thing that you should always re-examine with your team. Everyone should be able to contribute to it, talk about it, think about it, and it should adapt both based on your findings of doing it and also with where you're at in the project. Maybe the most obvious downside is that you can't paper prototype when you don't have paper, so that sucks, because paper prototyping is useful. And sometimes it's nice to get everybody and gather them around a big whiteboard and take notes while you're talking. A way that we approximate this is we have this like literal depiction of a whiteboard that I will screen share in Photoshop and write stuff while people are talking. It's okay. It's not as good as a normal whiteboard, but you take what you can. Video chat is inherently kind of unnatural, which I'm sure you've experienced if you've ever had like a call with your grandma around the holidays. There's just inherent lag. There's kind of this higher mental admission cost of saying things out loud. And overall, it's a lot harder to talk to one person when there are 6 other people on voice chat, because you know that your voice is going directly into everyone's ears in a way that doesn't really feel like as much of a big deal if you're in an open studio environment and just take one person aside to talk to them while everyone else still kind of has their headphones in. When you factor in that there's like a fraction of a second of latency with video chat, it can sort of make things a little bit harder to speak up. So it's just something to be mindful of, so you're always kind of asking people to contribute. Another kind of good, bad, bittersweet part is that we all really actually like each other a lot, which is great. But it also sucks because we can't hang out after work because we all live in different cities. A way that we kind of emulate this is that we'll like go get a drink after work, which means that we make martinis alone in our apartments while we talk to each other on video chat. Just yesterday we were like playing some Jackbox games and drinking cider, and it was really fun. But I wish that I could actually hang out with my coworkers more, because you get to know people really well when you work with them. So that's kind of a sweet but sad part. And even though I went over it, if you're not careful, you can still become a weird goblin trash person. It's still pretty easy to stay in your apartment all the time, even if you do get to talk to sort of real people in there. So I think it's just important to make sure you're doing stuff for your mental health and regular balanced life that you have to do very explicitly in a way that you do not if you have a normal studio job. So you just have to really endeavor to like schedule hangouts with friends, go get a gym membership, make sure you're getting yourself to take walks, and just maintain it. Like, go to things like the Full Indie Summit, which we're doing. We did it. So it's just really important to just be aware of when you're getting weird and check in with yourself more than you would if you had sort of like a normal studio job. So it's not perfect. There's ups and downs. I still really love it. It's my favorite way of working, and I think I prefer it to other ways that I've worked before. Our team is really wonderful. I love them all. They're really great, talented, wonderful people. And the reality is we wouldn't have been able to bring this group of people together if we didn't have the obvious benefits of this virtual studio setup. So my final thoughts, I think even if this seems like a bit extreme and non-applicable for your current work setup, which I think could be the case for a lot of people, there's still a lot of accessibility in how you can modify and scale and apply this to your team as it makes sense for your team. So I know a lot of people might have physical studios with like most of their people, but then have like 1 or 2 contractors that come in from other places. A way that you can kind of make this work is even if you just sort of scale it down, like maybe Tuesdays and Thursdays are your webcam days, or maybe just Friday afternoons, and you can kind of make those the pillars that you guide the rest of your work around and structure your week around. Next up, I really highly recommend this for aspiring game devs, students. It's a really great way to practice what it feels like to be in a studio environment that doesn't require a ton of resources or money, and you can kind of practice it with friends. So even if you just have side projects you do with 1 or 2 other people that you're just doing like for a couple hours in evenings, like turn on your webcam, try it out. It'll be a little less lonely, which is great. It makes it easier to communicate when you're actually collaborating with them. And when you do get your first game job, I think it will make it a lot easier to transition because you've kind of already figured out what that collaborative atmosphere looks and feels like. Another great thing is that there's just a good sense of solidarity and unity to seeing everybody working at the same time. You can look and see, oh wow, we're all going towards this goal in a way that isn't quite as easy to capture if you're just working on Slack or via email. Collaboration is really the heart of making a good game, as I'm sure we all know, and therefore it's better to use systems like this that encourage collaboration rather than make it something that you sort of have to rally against and fight super hard for. So yeah, I hope that we see more instances of this work happening in the years to come. There are so many benefits. I think the more that we decentralize people needing to travel a lot with the current climate crisis, it's not a thing I got into too much, but I think it's helpful. I think it's the way of the future. It's great to see conventions like Game Dev World happening where we're decentralizing and making things more accessible, and I just sort of see this as like the studio-based extrapolation of that model of thinking. So as a game developer working on a remote team, really I feel happier and more productive than ever before. I feel like I'm making the best work I have in my career, and even though this way of working isn't perfect, it's still pretty dang great. I really recommend people try it, even in a limited capacity. And I hope this has given you a spark of inspiration for things you can try in your own teams, even if this was just to let you know that this is a working model that can be successful and can be available to other people. Thank you so much for having me. I've wanted to do a full Indie Summit for a while since I first came, so thank you so much for listening. I love talking about this stuff, so if anyone has either questions now or at the mixer, I'd be so happy to. So thank you all. I feel like I went long. Okay.
We only have time for 2 questions, and they're both taken. So we're going to start here and then move over to the next one.
Hi, yeah, I find it really interesting that as a team, then everyone is involved in every conversation. So that seems like a really cool thing to have for a small team, but how does it work out practically in terms of the amount of noise that goes on while you're trying to paint, for example? Like how much of an hour, in a given hour, how many minutes of people talking is there?
I'm so glad you asked that question because that was the one slide that I had to cut to make time for myself. So yeah, it's a super good question. So yeah, there's always this kind of, there's like a tension between finding optimal communication so that you're making the game collaboratively and good, and also allowing people to get into a focused flow state. So typically with bigger things that have broader reaching affects on different departments, we'll keep those all in the studio room. But for example, if like the 2 writers want to go talk about something that is specifically world building or something like that that doesn't need as much input from other people, they'll go off into what we call the meeting room, or sometimes the party room, depending on how spicy we're feeling. And it's basically just like a separate conference room that they can talk without like interrupting people who are doing more like left brain stuff like programming. I find it's pretty easy to paint while hearing people talking, but sometimes it's really hard and you still need that. So yeah, it's kind of like sequestering off meetings when it makes sense, but even then they will announce like, hey, we are going off us 2 to talk about these things. Feel free to come in as a passive participant if you want to listen, or an active participant if you think it impacts your current work. So it's just a lot of communicating and trying to find a balance. But yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, I've been working from home for 4 years with a completely virtual studio. It's great. I highly recommend it too. You were saying about virtual whiteboards sucking. Miro is amazing, previously known as real-time board. My question is, you have this narrow band for where you can work from, mostly North America and South America. Have you considered expanding that to the whole world? And if so, how would you do it?
Yeah, so we have kind of in our first hiring cycle, we were mostly bringing on people who were leads who would be really driving their core departments. So given that we identified that having core studio hours on the webcam, the constrained band for time zone was sort of in service of that. But we have kind of talked about the option of now that we have our core studio that are sort of like the remote core studio that have the designated hours, it would make it a lot easier to bring in supplemental people, especially if they're people who are in non-lead positions who are doing more production. So it would be quite easy from my perspective as an art director to like bring on someone who's going to do a ton of props modeling or something where they can kind of follow stylization guides that we've already figured out. So it's sort of like figuring out how much that person would need to do real talk time and sort of bringing in people in a way that balances that nicely. So I could really see it being completely international with a remote studio and having some overlap. One of the people on my team, Nels Anderson, had kind of done a format like this with Campo Santo when they were making Firewatch, where a bunch of their studio was based in San Francisco, and then there were a few people in the UK who would kind of have a few hours a day of the remote call-in by webcam. They just literally had a TV on the wall with their faces. So it's kind of like a lot of things are viable, and it's a matter of like what fits with what you want to get out of your working process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Okay, thanks everybody.